Hello, and welcome to another episode of In Bed with Books. I'm your host, Melissa, and today we are rejoined by my friend Michael Pons. Michael, actually, I can do a little reintroduction really quickly. This is Dr. Michael Pons because you've just passed your PhD. Congratulations, round of applause. Yes, a little pat on the back. Would you please reintroduce yourself for first-time listeners?
Yes, hello. It's been a while since I've been on here. I am indeed Dr. Michael Pons. I just finished getting my PhD in English literature. And if you recall, if you saw me last time, my area of interest is in games as a kind of storytelling medium. Previously, I probably would have said as a narrative medium, but I think my project has shifted away from conceptualizing games as narrative in general. Um, and so recently, do you want me to give my dissertation kind of abstract now, or?
Yeah, I would go for it. Like, I guess I do want to know specifically, or I want like the listeners to know specifically, what was that question that you went into it with?
Yeah, one of the questions I would say kind of the animating question of my project, which is to say my dissertation, is more or less what is interactivity? What is happening when we believe ourselves to be interacting with a story? And why is it that games are so often, I think, heralded or praised as being a truly interactive medium? There are a ton of people that study what they call quote unquote interactive fiction. And there's this idea generally that video games are unique in the storytelling space because games, in theory, are interactive while other sort of, I guess, kinds of storytelling are not.
Okay. And I think, I guess like the abridged version of like why I keep bringing you on is one kind of because of that narrative now storytelling thing, which I do want to get into, but you're our like DM for our GM for Dungeons and Dragons. So of course that's like a huge, I think there's a lot of overlap with the kind of world building and creating that exists within the bookish community and the gaming community. This is like that center of the Venn diagram. But I want to, before we kind of dig into some of the other parts, because like I guess the thing is, I sat in on your dissertation defense, and about 20 minutes into it, I was like, oh my God, like I should be taking notes so we can talk about this on the podcast because there was so much overlap. Um, there's, like you said, this assumption of interactivity with games. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'll I'll spoil the ending, which is to say my dissertation, I ultimately kind of arrived at the conclusion that video games are not interactive. Um, but that's not my attempt. I'm not trying to do kind of an English old head thing where I suggest, oh, there's nothing new about video games. It's just Shakespeare did it all, right? I'm not suggesting that.
I mean, he did, but also there's
Right,
like a yes and
exactly.
here. Yeah.
Um, because what I learned the more I looked into it was that interactivity, even though it is a very commonly used term and most of us understand what we think it means when we say it, it was not a super well-defined concept in the discourse. A lot of different people have very different concepts of what it means for something to be interactive. And so I sort of began from the presumption when I was writing my dissertation. I began from the presumption that video games have interactivity, but that we just don't know how to describe it best. And a lot of scholars have attempted to do this, but I think that ultimately it turns into a weird kind of linguistic, philosophical rabbit hole that sort of raises all sorts of questions about agency and freedom, and so ultimately goes nowhere. My argument is that video games don't have interactivity because ultimately I believe that interactivity is not actually a structural characteristic. I don't believe that fiction or representation at all can possess interactivity because I believe interactivity is actually a feeling.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's a weird. it's a classic humanities like flipping the problem on its head
Yeah.
sort of solution, where I basically argue that interactivity has nothing to do with anything that looks like, a story that gives you choice or freedom or whatever. And it has everything to do with, does the game create within the player the sensation of having meaningful agency over the things that they're doing?
Hmm.
Which is to say, two players can play the same game, and one can experience it as deeply interactive, and the other might actually think it's stifling. Which is one of the reasons why it's not a structural characteristic. It is something that the player experiences. And the short version of it is that I believe that interactivity is a feeling that comes out of a very specific relationship between player desire or user desire, we might say, if we want to use more media agnostic language, user desire and system constraint. So the example that I like to give is, imagine you're playing a game for the game savvy in the audience, and you're walking along a trail and there's a short fence. And on the other side of the fence, there looks like there's a space that you want to go explore. If the game allows you to jump over the fence to go explore that area, you would likely describe the feeling of playing the game as being interactive because it has created within you the sensation that there's an open world that you can explore at your freedom. If the game doesn't allow you to jump over the fence, you might feel that the game is not interactive and that you have been kind of cordoned off in a very narrow way to explore only what the game has allowed you to explore. In reality, what this means is that it has created within you a desire and then either allows you to fulfill that desire or not. At no point during a lot of the games we play, like a lot of the games that are popular, whether it be, Legend of Zelda, like Breath of the Wild, or Tears of the Kingdom, or Baldur's Gate 3, there are so many more things that these games don't let you do that you don't care about because you don't desire to do them. In Baldur's Gate 3, you can't, I don't know, you can't make your character randomly just like sit down and start making a sandwich, right? That's not something, even if it occurred to you to do that, that's something you would never be able to do in the game, barring really, really weird circumstances that are scripted. But just because the game doesn't let you do that, it doesn't feel stifling because you don't want to do that.
Hmm.
You never at any point is there a desire in you to perform that course of action. And so we don't describe it as feeling stifling. What this means is that you can have a game that ostensibly offers you fewer choices, that feels more interactive because it understands its players' desires better. And you can have a game that gives you more freedom and more choices and still feel frustrating and stifling because it doesn't understand what its players want.
Part of this goes back to the relationship that's existing between the media itself, and I say media to kind of like we're gonna definitely gear this conversation towards books and literature, um, between the creation, the creator, and the receiver of it. Because even in books, I think, something that you and I talk about a lot lately is the like dwindling critical thinking skills and media literacy skills. Um, I think we've talked about it a lot when it comes to things like The Boys, the reception of it, and then the sudden like, wait, the show's about us from like a majority of the audience. In a very similar thing in like reading spaces right now, I think is called like Crawler Carl, where I've it's I mean it is on my list, but lower on the list because I've seen so many people talk about like, oh, the first book is so hard to get through, and they're like, no, this is like the first book is meant to be like that. Not difficult to read, but like the point of view is somebody who like has to change, right?
Oh, I see.
Very similar in that like it becomes clear later on that he's not quite as unbearable as he is in the beginning, if that makes sense. I guess like a
Yeah,
lot of misogyny.
it's like
That
Peacemaker.
yeah, Yeah, from what I know, like I guess that's the thing. I should also like make the amendment that I haven't seen The Boys, I haven't seen Peacemaker, but
Sure.
one I know a lot because of the things you tell me and because I'm chronically online. Um, and so there is kind of this like I think loss of acknowledgement or loss of understanding that when a writer or when like an author is writing a book and creating a story and new characters, there has to be some kind of conflict, and sometimes that conflict is at odds with who you, the reader, are as a person. But that doesn't mean it's not part of the experience as well. Because I guess like there is the reading experience, and I'm not just talking about like, what's your reading experience and like listing off your books, but no, like the actual sensations and thoughts and processes that go into reading a specific text. And that's like an intended part of what the writer or author was doing when creating that. Um, I guess kind of tying it back to games as well. I had sent you this post recently, and I don't remember what the game was called, but it was one of those like dating sims where they just kind of like slide up and they're like an art, like a static picture, and you get little chat options. And it was from the company that created the game. And there were, I guess, like three very specific characters that players were like, make this character romanceable because they were just like random NPCs that you just interact with for different parts of the game. And I find that so funny because you're talking about in some ways that desire has been anticipated. Looking at things like yeah, I grew up reading paranormal romance, YA paranormal romance, and this one's not necessarily a paranormal example, but Hunger Games, which is back in the news because every few years Susan Collins tries to write something to like warn us about the direction that our country is headed in. But the love triangle, it's like, yeah, she knew that people were gonna be into Gale. She anticipated that. She like it is written into the thing. But when you read it as an adult, it's also clear that Gale was never an option. And I find it very, I guess in some ways frustrating that we've lost that ability. I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't be so pessimistic about this, but like a lot of very loud voices have lost the ability to recognize that need for conflict, not just within the plot, but like at several meta levels of engaging with fiction.
Right.
Um,
I
yeah.
mean, it reminds me of what is it? Robert Pattinson made that joke recently that Team Jacob was just a marketing strategy, that nobody was actually Team Jacob.
Yeah,
Um, I was not really in the Twilight fandom when I was in what was that, middle school.
just
So
about.
but I can't. Maybe you know better than I, but like, is that true? Like, was nobody actually ever Team Jacob?
I mean, I met people that genuinely were Team Jacob, but I think as somebody who was like devoutly Team Edward,
Sure.
um, I do think there is this like it's funny, I was just talking to an author, um, she was on the podcast again recently, Kate Ballinger, and I feel like, we're talking about YA love triangles from the 2010s, but I do want to expand this to also this concept that you talked about of like fate and free will. It feels obvious, and maybe it's just because like I chose the quote unquote right one when I chose Edward as a teenager. It felt obvious because it's like, yeah, the entire story is about him. Jacob is just a speed bump in the way. He's just an obstacle to make it more interesting. Um, and maybe this is me being petty, but I do feel to some degree like the girls who were super Team Jacob were either A, doing it because Taylor Lautner himself was hot and they were just more attracted to Team Jacob. Like for me in my mindset, I was like, no, I'm Team Edward because Team Edward's gonna win. Edward's gonna get the girl in the end. And it's like I get if you're like, yeah, I will acknowledge that Taylor Lautner is hot, but I don't think he's getting the girl. And he got the girl's daughter in the end, which we don't need to get into.
That's yeah. We don't need to get into that. I think you're right though that it is it's an interesting question, and you brought up that idea of desire, which is something that I talked a little bit about in my dissertation with regard to interactivity. We could go into a whole, I guess, psychoanalytic rabbit hole about the nature of desire, but I do think it's interesting that people do get frustrated at the presence of conflict in stories sometimes because
Hmm.
they like I've seen this happen so many times in The Boys, which you just referenced. There was there's a very popular ship between two of the main characters that everyone was pretty certain was canon. I won't say any specifics, I guess. But in season 4, one of the characters had a random new love interest that was introduced out of the blue. And it seemed as if the show was pivoting away from, the OTP that everybody believed in. And I felt like I was going insane when season 4 was airing because I had, I think, a very similar hunch to you when reading Twilight. I was like, guys, clearly this is clearly the pair that everybody wants is the end game, okay? Clearly that's the end game. It always has been. There's still hints even in this season that it is, but they're doing conflict so that these characters can finally find a way back to each other and choose each other in a more resolute
Yes.
way rather than sort of just accidentally falling together, which was kind of happening as a result of the story, right? And so I didn't mind, and I turned out to be right. By the end of the season, they were back together, and it was like this monumentous, like they actually finally officially declared that they were into each other. But people were losing their minds on the internet. They were like, I can't believe they ruined this show by throwing away a romance that we've built up for 3 seasons. And I'm just like, come on, you guys, like just read a little bit. Like read the
Yeah.
subtext. Wait, be patient, see where it goes.
I do
Um,
think in some ways that does feel connected to like the bad side of the desire of the audience, which is like not having faith in the process. I am famously, not famously, but like with my like reader friends, famously a very difficult DNFer for books. And I think part of that is because there have been so many times when I've gotten to a point in a book when I'm like, you're actually pissing me off. And I just keep reading because part of me is like, I want to know out of spite. I want to know point by point why I actually don't like this book. And I will say that more times than not, it's paid off. And I think some of that again is just like going into trusting the process, trusting that the author has like good care of the story. And there's certainly been times when it has not paid off. And I recorded an entire episode like blasting a book because I had gotten it for an arc and I knew the author from when I was younger. I guess I'll just say it now because I'm not doing a whole episode on it anymore. I scrapped the episode, but it was on PC Cast's new book, Boudica, and I had gotten it through NetGalley, which for those of you who are like, how do I get arcs? Go to NetGalley, put in that you're a reviewer. People, publicists love to give out these books. I spent a good chunk of the book like, oh, there's just like a lot of like I guess downtime, if that makes sense. Um so she's preparing, for those of you not familiar with the myth of Boudica, this is uh I want to say Celtic specifically, but one of the like tribal queens who united a bunch of tribes together to fight the Romans. She made fairly decent progress, like really put a dent in their stuff, but didn't ultimately win the battle or win the war. And so I love a good historical or mythical retelling. I've got like Song of Achilles, Circe up here. I've got a few others. And it was just so much nothing happening. It starts out super violently, which like I get that. Like that's kind of what I'm getting into this like knowing. But then in the end, everyone she loves dies. She escapes and goes north. And then the like I guess what's supposed to be like the saving grace of all of this is that she ends up having a daughter in like the final pages of the book. And the ghosts of her loved ones who all died at the hands of the Romans help her give birth to this child. And then it just kind of like, like Finn, curtains fall, black screen. And I was just like, oh, all of that, that's the payoff. Like, very, I guess, like very little. One, I'll actually pull this back a little further because there is some of it that's like understanding the desires of your audience when you're going into writing something. If I'm reading a romance, I know they're going to end up happily ever after. I know there's going to be some kind of like second act or third act miscommunication or frustration or obstacle, which could be Jacob. Like in the full
Mhm.
arc of the series of Twilight, that is Jacob. Um, but some of this also goes back to how you're marketing a book. And so like if you're marketing a book or a game as a historical retelling of the superheroine that and like badass woman that is Boudica, and then she fails at everything she set out to do, that's fucking bullshit.
I feel like it would have to be marketed specifically as a tragedy. Like
Yes.
you would have to. I think there's a tendency in some authors and storytellers generally to believe that defying genre conventions is a noble thing for its own sake because they don't
Hmm.
want to be predictable or they don't want to be stereotypical. But genre conventions are actually very useful in that they let readers know in advance if it is a story that they're going to be interested in,
Hmm.
right? When, like you, exactly like you just said, when you pick up a romance novel, something that is marketed as romance, you expect there to be a romance. And
Yep.
if there isn't, it's almost like false advertising, right? You're pissed off. Um, I respect the tragedy. I like a bittersweet ending, but I do also feel like that if the story is marketed in a particular way, that's where you get that mismatch, right?
Hmm.
Everything about how the story is marketed and written, right? The system has created within you a desire, then it then is not capable of fulfilling. And
Yeah.
that's when you get frustrated and that's when you feel like, I don't know, the story sucks.
Yeah. And it's not like I think that historical retellings specifically have to follow things to a T. One of my favorites is Circe. And for those of you who have read it, you know, and for those of you who haven't, this is a very big spoiler, so be warned. At the very end of Circe, she leaves the island with Telemachus, with Odysseus's son. And it's not just like he happens to wander on the island. It's like there's, in the story, it's based around Circe's life, but there is a good chunk of it, of course, that's related to Odysseus because that's how we know most of her story. Um, so he gets home and he's not the like perfect husband that left. He's the guy who just had 20 years basically of like being fucked with by the gods. And that's not to give him a pass. Like in the book, he's very much painted as a kind of irredeemable character. But he gets home is not great to his wife and his son. His wife and his son leave, and they end up on Cersei's island. And there's kind of this like slow understanding between Cersei and Penelope, and then eventually an entirely different kind of understanding between Cersei and Telemachus. And I think it's like this joint started in the foundation of we understand how he is. And it's like that completely reshapes the the understanding of the myth and like her payoff. And I guess that's part of it too for me is that like going back to Boudica's like the if we want to call it a payoff. I'm pretty sure technically in the like histories of it, they say that she died in that final battle that we see in the book. In the book, what happens is one of her lovers disguises herself as Boudica, and then Boudica escapes through like their version of the spirit realm. And I guess that would have been fine if like we'd also rewritten like at that point just fucking rewrite it. Just like give us a story where she still kills the guy who like led to the severe sexual violence of her and her daughters. Because she wasn't like, yes, she was trying to get rid of Rome, but it was very much related to the violations that happened to her and her family, and that was never paid off.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so that's why it was very frustrating. Um, but again, I guess, sorry, bringing this back to like also like genre conventions and expectations, I think, I guess, kind of like you said, is like some people are kind of confusing what I would say is more like plot twists and surprises with genre bending. And that's not the same thing. Because you can absolutely do a plot twist by following the same structure of a gothic novel or a romance novel, or there was a romantasy that I read. I don't frequently get surprised by a plot twist because I'm a very paranoid reader and I'm already anticipating every like every slightly shifted thing that's like meant to be foreshadowing. I'm like, I'm clocking it and I'm making up new ones. Um, And you've seen me do this in D&D, so you know that I do this when I'm reading. But there was one where like I had a feeling somebody wasn't who they said they were, but then when the reveal about who they really were came out, blew me out of the fucking water. But also the rest of the book very clearly followed a romantasy like structure. And I just don't think I think some people aren't as good at breaking conventions as they think they are.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of thoughts about all of this, and I'll start by saying that I think a lot of the contemporary online media landscape has trained many of us to be very suspicious readers. And I think that it's gotten increasingly difficult for media to be genuinely surprising in a good way. Because I think so many of us now, we're looking for clues, we're looking for foreshadowing because we want to guess the twist before it happens.
Yeah.
And I think that in many ways, this has trained a certain kind of reader that thinks that they can uh, get the better of the author.
Yeah.
Like we want to feel like we're smarter than the author. And this has resulted in, I know a couple of people who think that a movie is bad if they can predict the twist. I went and I saw a horror movie one time. I think it was The Color Out of Space, which was like the Richard Stanley adaptation of the Lovecraft. Um,
Crazy movie, by the way.
Crazy movie. But I had a friend who, as soon as the weird stuff was happening with like the llama or the alpacas getting fused together, it's a crazy movie for those of you who haven't seen
It's
it.
a lot of body horror, just be warned.
It's a lot of body horror. But he immediately predicted, based upon seeing that like two of the family members would get fused together by like the strange energy. And then when it happens in the story, he's like, "Man, I saw this coming a mile away. That was disappointing." And I'm like, "You're disappointed that the author planted hints and then followed through on a thing?"
Like it's a
Like,
horror, it's gonna actually get worse, which implies that like yeah, that is what's gonna happen.
right. And I think George R. R. Martin has talked about this before, where it's like, no, actually, that's part of what makes a coherent story is that the hints that you plant along the way ultimately do point somewhere meaningful. Um, and I think that on the one hand, I need that certain kind of reader to chill out a little bit. I need you to
Yeah.
say like just because you predict the twist doesn't make it bad, doesn't make it a disappointing twist.
Hmm.
However, and I think that there's another kind of twist that I think is less people so our friends we were watching Westworld recently. We rewatched the first season of Westworld.
Original or
Um
the reboot?
the reboot,
Okay.
the TV series. And I love Westworld. I will be on record as saying that I think for seasons one and two of Westworld are two of my favorite TV seasons like ever. But Westworld is a series that thrives very much on its mystery and its desire to outsmart the audience, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. There are certain twists that happen in Westworld season one, some of which I think there are hints and you can guess it beforehand. But there's one twist in Westworld season one that I don't think you could possibly predict. I don't think it's I literally don't think it's possible to predict it. But, and here's the big caveat, it makes perfect sense in retrospect. And upon a rewatch of the season, everything is different. Everything about rewatching the first season of Westworld is different once you know who a certain character is. Because it's a weird character identity thing where you think you're seeing a character in these scenes, but it's actually a different character that you don't realize yet.
Interesting. Okay.
And I think it's wonderful. I think it's amazing, but I think a lot of people find it frustrating if there's a twist that you couldn't guess at all, even if it does make sense in retrospect. Um, I think that I'm inclined to take your side, which is to say, like, I will cope something that I like, like to the extent of if somebody's frustrated with how something is going, you have this kind of like, well, just finish the book and see if the author sticks the landing and understands what they're doing. I often think like I'm skeptical when people don't like things. I'm like,
Yeah.
did you not like it because you genuinely think it's bad, or did you not like it because the story didn't go how you wanted it to go?
Yeah.
And I often wonder, so like Game of Thrones, I think, is the poster child for, season finale or series finale that people found disappointing. And I'm not here to argue that it wasn't a disappointing series finale, but part of me wonders, like, if Game of Thrones started airing again today in the current media landscape, and it wasn't already a beloved series of books that predated the TV show, would people be mad about the Red Wedding? Like, I think there are a lot of people who would just say the Red Wedding sucks. Like,
Yeah.
like,
Like you can't kill off that many main characters at once.
right?
Kind of
Oh,
bullshit.
it's
Yeah.
just shock value and gore, and the writers have no idea what they're doing, and
Yeah.
clearly they have like, I could anticipate those kind of arguments and those kind of critiques. I think Game of Thrones is saved by the fact that that was already in the books, and
Hmm.
so people already knew it was coming, right? That was not a surprise.
I
But
think
I think people have a tendency to confuse story beats that they don't like with bad story beats.
yes. And I think the like page versus screen of Game of Thrones is a very, very good example of kind of what we're talking about here with, the stepping out of the book, like the book as a physical thing and the engagement between like the different people involved with making it a book. If, you mentioned that Martin kind of very explicitly says expectation of story beats is what makes it a story. And I think that is actually exactly why the finale wasn't as well received. Kind of going back to this other point about like it's not genre bending. You're not just like you can't just do stuff just to do stuff. Because, I think two kind of examples of the different sides of this that I'm talking about is one, Brienne of Tarth and
Jamie,
Jamie's like arc together.
right?
I don't think they needed to end up together. I would have loved if they ended up together because I think it would have shown just how much he's grown because he had actively grown so much, but then him returning to Cersei was actually the worst possible thing they could have done for him, especially after like him and Bran having that little moment together in the final season, I think it was. Um, but then the other half is kind of the like reception of Arya after sleeping with Gendry and then doing exactly what you could expect Arya to do. Like, yeah, she had a good time. I shipped that from the second I saw them, like, not even getting together, but just like in on the same scene, like screen together, the little
Right.
dynamic. And I will say it was like, yeah, because this little girl has this obvious like has this cute crush on this teenage boy, and because she's a tomboy, she has to be like weird about it. But people who were like saying like they got them together, that was just fan service because now it's like, no, that was actually her like taking ownership of herself and her path. And I think in some ways it's like, but that also is clear to me as a woman who loves those kinds of storylines. But I would, you could probably make the argument that that's not entirely the demographic of people that are watching this show and engaging with it. And so if you want to do that storyline, you have to give more hints to what's going on in her head. I think that is like a hard part about like screen versus book, just in general, is like
That's true.
unless it's like a very specific, like the show you, we get all of his internal stuff, but otherwise it's just screen, it's just what people decide to say.
Right. We don't get the interiority of the characters on the screen the same way we do on the page. I personally just think that, and I understand this is maybe asking too much of a lot of people, but I think that we ought to just be able to say like that makes sense, and it's not a bad or not a good or a bad narrative decision, but it's just not something like there there's a very popular game series, and I am responding to what you're saying. There's a very popular game series called The Last of Us. It was adapted into a also popular TV series by
I've never
Amazon.
heard of it.
Yeah. My tattoo is inspired by Ellie's tattoo in The Last of Us Part Two. Um, The Last of Us Part Two, I think, has become the poster child of controversial decisions. Um, because a certain character dies in The Last of Us Part Two, that a lot of people like, that is a very major character in the first game, and a lot of people, it has become sort of the rallying call, I think, of angry incels on the internet to be mad about this character's death because they believe it's some kind of weird political, extra diegetic, like man-hating critique death that betrays a certain that, quote unquote, this character would never act like that. This character would never make that mistake. This is a character who's much older, who's gotten softer, and who also is, I think, trying to be a better person than they were in the first game. And I think it's a tragic story beat, but I think similar to the Red Wedding, it's a really interesting story beat that I think makes sense and drives the story forward.
I mean, you could make the same argument for um Ned Stark dying at the beginning
Yeah,
of or the end of season one, like in the very first season of Game of Thrones. And I guess, you just said a few minutes ago that if Game of Thrones were to come out now, how would some of these things be received?
right. And I think, to play devil's advocate for a second, even though I don't necessarily believe this to be true, right? Take something like Jaime Lannister's character arc. I could be convinced that there is a certain poetic, destiny tragedy of Jaime being unable to move beyond Cersei and going back to her, and then, whatever happens, happens at the end of the finale. I guess it's your fault if you haven't seen Game of Thrones at this point, right?
Yeah,
Jaime and
it's
Cersei
several years
die.
old. Yeah.
Yeah. And I get, like, this is not me challenging you and saying that this isn't a bad story, but I think there's part of me that wants to be like, well, is that bad, or is it a tragedy, and does it make sense that this character's story would end this way? And I do think ultimately they shouldn't have spent as many seasons as they did hinting that Jaime was going a different direction to then like
Yeah.
pull the rug out. I think it's the rug pull that's the most annoying part.
Yes. And I guess my thing is it seems like they just wanted a rug pull with a lot of the I
Right.
guess in a similar vein, the most prominent one complaint from the finale is that we get the Mad Queen Dany.
Right.
And like there certainly are a couple of hints, but she just spent the previous several seasons proving herself to be like careful and like the people's princess essentially. And then there just wasn't enough of the hints that she was going to be the Mad Queen.
Right. I
Mm.
think I think Mad Queen Danny in a vacuum is a great narrative development for the end of the show. I think it makes sense.
I would have bought it with like the extra episodes and seasons that
Right.
HBO was like offering them.
Right. That's ultimately what I think the problem. I think Mad
Yeah.
Queen Danny makes sense, but I think it wasn't set up properly.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it feels so frustrating. But then, I want to separate that from like I think there's a lot of people who now are not going to like Mad Queen Danny no matter what.
Yeah.
Because Daenerys Targaryen is their favorite character, and they want her to win, and they want her to sit on the Iron Throne, and they're incapable of separating good storytelling and what would make sense for the story from their like for that particular character. I'm not saying the show handled it well,
Yeah.
but I'm saying Mad Queen Danny, I could see that being part of Martin's plan for the books, and I could
Hmm.
see that working if it's executed properly. But I think there are all going to be people that hate it no matter what.
Yeah. And I kind of want to tie this back to that original idea of like one, interactivity, but also the second idea of like fate versus free will. Um, because part of this also goes back to, in my opinion, this need to be the smartest one in the room, essentially. And in this case, I'm not talking about like the audience like trying to anticipate every possible outcome. But also, if you have these rug pulls, is it the author's attempt to also be the smartest one in the room when it's like that actually shouldn't be part of the process at all? I think something that we talk about sometimes when we're like talking about D&D stuff, like because we just finished our long, like 2.5 year campaign. We're starting a new one right now. I know, like, bye bye, Mira. I did actually cry at the end of that.
Sure.
But part of that had a lot to do with, even as we're starting up some of this new stuff and we're kind of hashing out and finishing out what the characters are going to look like, at least to start, is we're actively figuring out what are their flaws. Like, what things are they going to work on through the storytelling and through this little like I hate to say container. I feel like container is like for this such an overused, but like this like almost like storytelling vessel that we're all entering together. And it's because none of us are trying to be the smartest one in the room. We're all trying to create an interesting character that is going to be fun to play for the next however long it takes. Um, but yeah, I think if you've got people involved in the process or because I guess when I say like make a book, I'm not talking about like printing and writing and publishing. I'm talking about like if I leave all of these books here and I never touch them again and they're never read, it's not serving its purpose. There's no function. So it's not like yeah, it's a book in like the very basic sense of the term, but the story is kind of like the if a tree falls in the forest, is there and then nobody here to hear it. And so if everybody involved in that process of like hearing the tree isn't like trying to be the smartest one in the room, the story's been lost entirely.
No, I mean, what you're saying is true also in kind of in a deeply profound way. I mean, there's a systems theory way of thinking about how books function as machines or technology in a way, which is to say that a user is actually required to, and this is more of a post-structuralist argument, but you're
Yeah.
producing the text at the moment that you are reading it. The book, in and of itself, is a material object that contains language, which is a community-based, system of semiotic meaning. So there's symbolic meaning within the text itself. But in a very radical kind of way, the user is required to give that meaning,
Hmm.
right? If aliens discover this book 400 years from now and they are trying to reconstruct the English language through whatever means, the text might radically mean something else to them because it's a different reader with a different understanding who's approaching the text from a different perspective. So you're right, which is to just kind of affirm what you just said.
Oh, thanks.
Um, I think that people, there's a thing about character arcs that I think you've been saying a little bit here, which is to say that we have forgotten that it's okay for characters to have like a positive character arc.
Hmm.
We don't like it when a character who's the character we're supposed to be rooting for is imperfect. And so you referenced kind of Dungeon Crawler Carl for, the main character not being particularly likable at first. I haven't read it, so I'm not sure. But Peacemaker was the same way. That's my, I guess, cultural touch point here. Peacemaker kind of sucks when you first start watching the show. I mean, he shows up in the Suicide Squad, and he starts out as a hero, but he kind of becomes a villain. But over the course of the series, he has this positive character arc where while by the end you kind of want to root for him, but you have to stick with it at first. And it goes back to, I guess, what you were saying before about wanting to give the author some credit and just say, okay, let me see where this goes. I think there's a tendency these days, and I kind of understand why, but I think there's a certain fear of making characters flawed because it's almost seen as an endorsement of that character's worldview or like an
Yeah.
acceptance of that behavior. Um, and I also think that there's been a shift in media over the past couple of decades to want to have more sympathetic villains, right? Villains are not evil people, they're just misunderstood. And so
Hmm.
once you see their perspective, then you sympathize with them, even if they've landed kind of in a wrong position. And that has produced, I think, in a lot of contemporary media, a fear of actually just having truly evil characters. Um, like you can't have a character who is just, I don't know, like racist or homophobic without them being, I don't know, so comically evil to the point of them just being like a throwaway side character. They could never really be a main villain. Or God forbid, you have a complex character who is a quote unquote good guy, but who actually has a character flaw, like maybe they're ignorant or they're a little bit narrow-minded. And then
Hmm.
over the course of the story, that has to change. Um, you can't have like a Zuko style character, right?
Yeah.
Who starts out a villain because nobody wants to start out rooting for the villain.
I think that's actually a really good example too, because of course the leaked movie came out, or the movie leaked. It did not come out. The movie leaked recently, and not to like put on my like holier than thou hat for a second, I did not watch it. And it's not because I don't know how. It's um it's definitely because of the ethics.
Same.
But yeah. Um this is of course brought out all of the like Katang versus Zutara shippers again. And in a surprise to no one, I am a Zutara shipper. I respect Katang. I will say, like, I think it both works. I think both works. Okay, I won't get too far into that. Um, but one of the surprising things for me actually is seeing the number of people that come out in the Zutara fandom and say, "Well, I liked Zuko when he was bald with a ponytail." It's like, congratulations. Here's your gold star. Like, I
Right.
don't know what you want for that. Um, And so there is this kind of like, I guess it's like a micro example, but this like, well, I've always X, Y, and Z. So I think this kind of steps so far out of the like the very central part of our conversation here, which is just like in online spaces, one, the fear of making mistakes, the fear of being perceived as making a mistake, and then kind of like the bigger thing, which is the attempt to paint yourself as always on the like what would be perceived as the correct side.
Right.
I did see a clip recently that was like, I think more people, and if I can find the clip, I will link it in the video here. more people need to destroy the cop in their head.
Yeah.
And beyond just the like regular people need to be punished kind of thing, but the like thinking anybody who makes a mistake deserves punishment. Because then it adds to the further question of what are we defining as mistake? What are we defining as punishment? It's all subjective. Because in some, like, again, to bring it back to this Zutara thing, is like to some degree, these people who are claiming they always liked Zuko when he was just this bald kid with a ponytail are trying to act like anything less is not as important. It's a mistake to have missed the obvious signs at the beginning that he was going to be redeemed. It's like, but it actually wasn't obvious. The whole point is that he was that far gone. And then we get, that's why it's such a juicy redemption. I still watch that every couple of years because it's
Yeah.
just, it's such a good version of storytelling. Um, I know I wanted to keep this to an hour, so I will like, I think we could probably keep going on a conversation like this. One, before I interrupt you, do you have any final thoughts here on this? Because I do have like kind of one final question that I'm hoping we can round
Yeah, I
things
mean,
out with.
I think authors should just, aside from maybe certain concerns about fears or social pressures of depicting certain characters certain ways, I know I'm being ambiguous here. I think we should want real characters. We should want
Hmm.
flawed people, not necessarily as an endorsement of their worldview, but as a recognition of that these perspectives exist, right? And that someone can be more complicated than just being a good guy or a bad guy. You can be a real person. You know, you can be a bad person fighting for the protagonist's side. You can be a good person fighting for the villain's side. I want more complex characters. I feel like in the stories that I encounter these days, and so I had Zuko. I have a hard time imagining a TV series doing something as good as Zuko these days. Um, a save for Invincible because Omni-Man is going on a bit of an arc right now. Shout out Invincible. It's amazing. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I like that. And I think some of that interactivity from the book, the reader side, definitely requires having some degree of at least like minorly complex characters. The classic of like seeing yourself in a book or suddenly understanding more about yourself because you don't like a character. Um, I think an example, I would say that I'm willing to bet you read this, The Great Gatsby.
Yeah,
Unreliable narrator.
yeah,
And we know he's like to some degree, like, I don't want to say in love, maybe even just platonically, like in love with, um, I keep thinking Nick, it's not, it's Gatsby. Like Nick, the narrator, having some kind of like preference in his telling for Gatsby. And it's like, but what do you learn about yourself in recognizing that Nick is painting a very positive picture, if we want to call it that, of like Gatsby's behavior? What does that say about oh, what's her name? Daisy. I haven't read this in years. About Daisy and her behavior. Like what can we read now that we know that he's an unreliable narrator? And how much of it do you actually believe?
right.
Yeah, I think in fiction, in things where you're not like making choices, when you're not like a part of the story in the same way as you are in games, your experience and your like the way it shifts you is that interactivity.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. There's there is interactivity in traditional, time-based media. But it has to do less with how does the story play out, and it has everything to do with um how are we choosing to read the text?
Hmm.
Um, what what sort of affordances and what kind of even speculation are we doing subtextually that changes, quote unquote, changes the text itself?
Yeah. And I think you can take this back to just early novels in general. Of course, 18th, 17th and 18th century are kind of the crux of what I know pre 20th century, just because that's what I studied in my master's. But a lot of those, not all, but a good chunk of them are epistolary. And if they're not epistolary, the narrator still will occasionally talk to the reader. It's like if we're going back to, it's like it's because novels and written stories, so novels, story like TV shows and television and movies and games are direct branch offs of sitting around a fucking campfire and oral tradition and a storyteller like Homer looking around and telling the story. Um, there's an example that came up to mind earlier was actually Hadestown, the musical, because the opening lines of the music are it's a sad song. You know it's going to be a tragedy. If
Mm.
you don't know the story, they tell you from the beginning it's not going to end well. And so yeah, I think there's this kind of like question of how is each medium changing our understanding of storytelling. So I guess that's also my last question is you started out by saying you initially were asking about narrative, but you shifted that over to storytelling. What's the distinction, and then why was that decision made?
So originally, I was using the term narrative because one of the ways that people study games is called narratology, which is the study of games as narrative, and as a vehicle for this thing. I originally was using narrative, I guess, more to mean what I'm now calling storytelling. But depending on what kind of literary critical discourse you're engaging with, narrative is a very specific thing. It doesn't just mean story. It means a particular kind of retelling of a story, a descriptive story that is recounted by a narrator, either the protagonist of the story or a kind of third person omniscient. But it is a thing that has already happened that is, in theory, being recounted to the reader in retrospect, even if the character is narrating the events as they are unfolding. The very nature of the medium of text, of written words, implies that this is something that has been inscribed and then recounted because somebody had to write it. There's a different way of thinking about a different kind of storytelling, and it goes back to Aristotle, and it has to do with drama. And so as my project went on, and as I read more and I found different perspectives on actually what video games do and what video games are, and at the encouragement of my advisor, Timothy Morton, I actually came to realize that in terms of its character, like the structural elements of how games play out, is actually far more akin to drama than it is to narrative. In the sense of drama is something that is fundamentally meant to be performed. Drama is something where the representation is created by players, actors, if you will, but I like the slippage between player and player between stage plays and video games. There is a player that is required to actuate the representation that the story plays out in. Video games are that because with a video game, you are the performer, right? If it is a single player game, if I'm playing The Witcher, um, this is, you know, Michael Pons putting on a performance as Geralt of Rivia
Okay.
and me having to make the decisions as this character that then cause the story to play out, not as a retelling, but in theory, in real time. Because as
Hmm.
I'm seeing the game play out, it is happening for the first time in theory, at least as I experience it. And so I dropped narrative because Aristotle explains that narrative and drama are actually two distinct things. And I started pressing this idea that games, rather than narrative, are drama. Um, I think that there are still some tensions between video games and drama, which is to say that in a video game, the performer is also the audience, whereas with a stage play, the performer and the audience are two distinct entities. I think that's something I want to look into further. But I do think that drama works better as a framework for how people interact with the interactivity of video games. That looks very different than how people engage with the interactivity of narrative, which I do think is real, um, akin, or rather against the kind of people who suggest that they study interactive fiction, um, which implies the existence of non-interactive fiction, which I'm not sure is a thing.
Yeah, I would argue that doesn't exist, but
Yeah, I agree
yeah.
fundamentally.
Fundamentally, I think every time you engage with a piece of fiction, I guess this goes back to the like accidental post-structuralism that I mentioned earlier, which was just that like in reading a book, that experience is inherently interactive, but not in the like version of interactivity that is like, you're not choosing the story, but you are receiving a response to that, even if the response is, I fucking hate this book.
Right. Yeah. Um, or if the response is like, oh, hey, I'm recognizing that Nick in The Great Gatsby is an unreliable narrator. Allow me to actually try and find the moments where I might read between the lines to figure out what's really not
Hmm.
not to suggest that there is something that's really going on, but to add a kind of nuance to my understanding of the events that the novel has recounted and maybe figure out if there's more to these characters than Nick's perspective is allowing me. It's like
Yeah.
not to drag on, but did you see the Knives Out movies?
Fuck yeah, I've seen Knives Out.
Okay, so Wake Up Dead Man. Did you see Wake Up Dead Man?
No, I haven't seen it yet.
Okay, you need to watch Wake Up Dead Man because the whole at the heart of Wake Up Dead Man is a retelling of a family story that is fundamentally grounded in a perspective from an unreliable narrator that then changes as the story goes on.
Okay. Yeah, I love that. It's not like I haven't wanted to be clear. It's just I'm very much like I have to be in the right mindset
Yeah,
to watch or engage with things. Bringing it back again to the Gatsby example, I think even pulling it back from unreliable narrator, and I do have a very good example of another unreliable narrator. The whole thing with Great Gatsby is the perceived portrayal at the end when Daisy just like all of this shit hits the fan and Daisy just leaves. She goes back to her cushy little life on the other side of the bay or whatever it is. Um, you could make one argument, which is that Nick is a very misogynistic uh narrator, unreliable narrator. All of his stuff rooted in his and Gatsby's perception of Daisy's response to this attention. And there is still, of course, the argument about like, idle stay-at-home moms and the excitement of an affair. And I think that's very much still a story that gets told on Hulu at least once a year with like a limited series. Um, but then you could arguably step back again and say, shit, who's the guy who wrote it again?
F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Fitzgerald.
Yeah,
My head was just like Zelda, but
yeah,
it's because now we know the kind of shit that F. Scott Fitzgerald did to Zelda, to his
right,
wife. And it's like, is Nick that much of an unreliable narrator, or is some of this also Fitzgerald's own unreliability as an author with a lived experience?
yeah,
And I think that's something you also can't escape because no author is creating anything in a vacuum.
right. And that opens up an even deeper kind of layer of interpretation, which is to say, is it possible that Nick is an unreliable narrator, even if F. Scott Fitzgerald didn't intend him to be so?
Yes. Yeah.
Um, this is where you get into kind of, I guess, a psychoanalytic um, perspective on literary discourse, which is to say that in the same sense that you and I could have a Freudian slip where we say something that is like on our mind by accident, language has meaning, and sometimes we say things that have meaning that we didn't intend when we wrote it, but nevertheless have meaning.
Hmm.
Um, you can read through the lines of a text and say actually like what we're getting is Nick's perspective, and Nick's perspective is F. Scott Fitzgerald's perspective, and that tells us something about what F. Scott Fitzgerald believes to be true about the world. And even though this is a fictional account, right? I'm not suggesting that Daisy, for instance, is a real person
Yeah, no.
because it's fiction. But nevertheless, that opens the door to a kind of reading that says even if F. Scott Fitzgerald did not want us to sympathize with this character, could we imagine, could we imagine a Daisy that is not condemned to be misrepresented by Nick and by F. Scott Fitzgerald? And I know this is a thing you wanted to touch on, but I think this comes back to this idea of like ownership, right?
Hmm.
Who does the story belong to? Does it belong to the author, or does it belong to the community of readers who, after the fact, have taken it up and chosen to figure out what the story actually means in a kind of interpretive sense?
Yeah, I actually like we didn't even touch on that at all. I would love to do a second episode just talking about that. Um, because I do think now, like having used this example of Fitzgerald, we're stepping back from the interactivity of the player or the reader or the audience member into like viewing it from the opposite side, which is from the side of the creator of the work of fiction. Um, and you know, the obvious question then with the ownership is looking at fan fiction.
Right?
And if we want to talk about the sandbox and the here's the fence and it's like, is there actually anything on the other side of the fence? Fan fiction is such a robust space to explore that. So I think we will save that for
Yeah,
another episode.
I think it's super interesting, and I think that it's a complicated topic that we should talk about more. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Dive down the rabbit hole.
So in that case, I'll call it time of death. Um, yeah. Thank you so much for joining me again. This is more or less like something that I'm actively trying to do again is something that I'm calling re-intellectualizing myself. For those of you who have been listening to the podcast for a long time, you know that I've been to through a master's. I've done like decent amount of higher ed. I'm not a doctor, but so don't if you're on a plane, I can't help you.
Yeah, I
Um,
can help you if I'm on a plane. I'm gonna
yeah.
help you.
Um, Getting back into reading romanticy helped me kind of reform those synapses, those connections in my brain that allowed me to read fiction. And now I'm back to a point where like I feel comfortable engaging with texts like this again. And so it's very exciting to have these conversations and to know that the post-structuralism is still somewhere deep in my brain, just waiting to come out, apparently. Um, but yeah, I'm very hard pressed to fight against the forces of anti-intellectualism and the lack of media literacy. We both watched The Pit. You haven't, I think you still have to catch up though, right?
Yeah, I still have to catch up.
I think that's a very solid example of media literacy being, very lackadaisical online. So it's very exciting to have these conversations, and I hope that to some degree we're Michael's hyper academic and then my understanding, but maybe more layman terms versions of the things are showing that actually it's not as intimidating as I think a lot of people online like to make it seem. Um, but yeah, I don't, are you guys, yeah, if there's anywhere that viewers and listeners can find more about you, Michael, do you want to plug anything?
Um, it's a good question. I really ought to make a website at some point because I'm on the job market. So I don't have that. Whatever. I do have an Instagram. It's mackerel underscore prawns. Spelt like the sea creatures, mackerel and prawns, because it sounds like my name. Um, Otherwise, I'm not very present on a lot of other social media. Like I'm not on Twitter. So yeah, you can find me here.
Cool. Okay. I'll plug that down below. And if and when you do get a website/portfolio up, I can also plug that. But otherwise, thank you everybody for joining us for another one. Thank you for sticking it out. If you've made it all the way here to the end, make sure to like and subscribe because it does help the podcast. But otherwise, have a great day and happy reading.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of In Bed with Books, a bookish podcast for bookish babes. Make sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all of the latest updates. And if you have any suggestions for authors, books, or topics that you want to hear about on the podcast, then feel free to DM me on Instagram or shoot me an email. I'm wishing you a lovely rest of your day, and until next time, happy reading.